Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan here at Launch Academy, here to bring you some of the final episodes of the HTML show. We're going to be wrapping up our exploration of HTML, the foundation framework, and some of these actual designs that we're doing for the HTML show episode. So today we're going to focus on what we call the detail page, or the page where we'll actually be able to play an episode in future versions of the site. And we're going to focus today primarily on getting the layout oriented, much like we did with the first page, and just be very focused on building that mobile first design and expanding that outward to reflect a positive desktop experience as well. So we're going to apply these same exact principles here in the second page, and practice is all about repetition, so that's what we're going to do today and really round out our exploration of HTML with actual real-world pages to integrate. All right, so let's get to it. So we've got this index page that we've generated, and if you remember, it looks something like this. And we tightened up the desktop experience in the last episode, but we've got a wonderful mobile experience that's happening here as well. And so one thing that's always a good idea to keep in mind when you start a new page is to think about some of the reusable components that you can apply to the second page. So we've got some duplication of elements here in this design, primarily as it pertains to the launchers also watched view here. So as we get to the bottom of the page, we'll be able to reincorporate some of the work that we did in the first and original page. But we're going to start from the top and work our way down, and we're going to make this a very mobile-friendly design and experience. All right, so let's dive in. So the first thing we'll notice is that we've got a black border all the way around. So that's actually fairly consistent with some of the work that we did on the top of our index page here. So we can reuse this masthead ID to start our page. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to just duplicate our index.html page just to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to call it detail.html, and I'm going to delete everything except leading up to the script there. So we're in pretty good shape there. And per the design, we've got the video square with a centered play button on it. And then the header that we're going to want is going to be the name of the episode. So we'll probably have to treat that a little bit differently than what we did on the index page. And as a web developer, you're going to have to consistently sort of compare and contrast the work that you have previously done with the work that you're about to do. And as a software engineer, you always want to be setting out on a path where you're not repeating yourself. It's really important to create modular, reusable code because that makes it easier to maintain and easier to read over time. Awesome. Okay. So let's use that masthead, but we're going to vary the inner content quite a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create sort of a pretend box for our video screen here. So we'll call this, it'll probably be, it's unique to the page, so we can use an ID, main video player, and then we're going to want an H1. And again, I'm trying to get the semantic structure down first before focusing on the aesthetics. So looking at the design, we want that class number 1 hello world to be an H1. And we're going to have some paragraph text. All right. So we're going to say class number 1 hello world. And then we're going to have some paragraph text here. And that paragraph text is going to be white. And we'll just use some lorem ipsum for right now. All right. So I'm going to navigate to the new page that we're on. And we've got a little bit of work to do here, right? We've got to style that div to get the representation that we want. And we've got to modify this H1 to be a little more normal. So I'm going to qualify this masthead as a detail screen, okay? So here on the masthead, we're going to add the video detail. And we're going to change that H1 to reflect this aqua color. And this is going to be the first step towards making this a little bit more divergent. And we're going to actually want to bring that text, that font size down quite a bit. Let's see what that looks like. So we've got masthead video detail H1. And we're going to put that underneath. We may actually have to contain this, and we may run into some issues with the ID being such a specific selection. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this body ID video detail, and that's going to allow us to get even more specific. So hopefully that will allow us to apply the styling that we're looking for here. We're going to actually make this masthead a class so that we can get a little more specificity there as well, because it doesn't look like our rule is getting observed. Interesting. Okay, so we've got body ID video detail. Oh, it's that issue that we ran into in a previous episode where we had to restart our server. Weird that that's reoccurring. So let's go ahead and do that again. So MAMP was playing a little bit of a trick on me, and my CSS was not actually updating with my changes here. So that's going to create some headache for us. So let's see if a restart helped, and it did. And we can actually back out some of our changes here to go towards the preferred implementation. Oh. We'll still want to apply that alternative implementation here. And it has to do with the ID-based selection being predominant. All right, so we've got that. Now let's build out the box. So this box is going to span the width of the available page. And we can use some of our example code in the index page to build a similar semantic experience there. And we're going to use CSS to change the look and feel of it. So I'm going to copy all of this text. And that's looking pretty good. But we're going to use this main video player ID to basically isolate and disambiguate this component. So again, we're thinking about how we don't necessarily need to repeat ourselves, and we can semantically represent the same object, but treat it a little bit differently aesthetically. So Sorry, I just wanted to record some of this. So if we do a refresh now, we'll see the familiar thumbnail here, and we want to expand that to represent the full width of the available masthead, and we want to center it as well. So we're going to use this main video player as sort of a place in a foothold to style that particular element. So go down to the bottom of the page, and we'll stylize the main video player. And we're going to text align that to the center. And we're going to width 100% on the thumbnail itself. Episode thumbnail. So you can see how the ID-based selector allows us to isolate this particular instance of the episode thumbnail. So let's see how this affects our display. So we're seeing the width of 100%, and we'll actually make that, we'll actually put that on the image itself. And that looks rather ugly, but don't worry, we're going to work on that. And if we're practicing mobile first design, we should also be in the mobile display. All right. So the other update that we have to do is get the play button to appear in the middle of the screen rather than in the bottom left-hand corner. So we also have to make some changes to how that is styled. So we're going to do a margin. We're going to first refer to some of the CSS that we're overriding here. If you remember, we made the position relative for the episode thumbnail, which we already have and can take advantage of. And then the icon overlay has an absolute position. And that is ideal. So let's find out what happens when we text align, center, and vertical align, middle. I think we'll still have some work to do. We want to adjust these positions here so that they actually don't take effect. So we basically need to clear out that top in that left, or that bottom in that left. I think what we can actually do is actually use percents there. Let's see how that works. That's a little better. So that's not bad, but we also need to account for the width of the element itself. So it's going to start at 50%, which means we're always going to show a little bit to the right. So that's a problem that we have to address. We could actually make the position relative rather than absolute and see where that brings us. just seeing how some of these properties are going to affect that overlay. Essentially, what we want is this icon overlay to have the same width and height as the actual element here, but we want to put a play icon in the middle of it. So we are going to need absolute positioning. And we may need to statically set the bottom and the left here, which is not ideal. And I think what we can do is if we text align center and we set the width of the icon overlay to 100%. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay. So we're going to get rid of that. Good. Okay. So what I needed to do is actually have the icon overlay box have an explicit width so that the absolute positioning knew where to place the element. So we're a little closer, and that's a little bit nicer of placement. And I really want to get rid of that bottom and see if I can accomplish that in a different way. And the way I might be able to do it is if I set my margin bottom, or really margin top and bottom to auto. Let's see how that. And this is the lovely world of CSS, is just trying a few different approaches to see what works. So we can set the height to 100%, see if that gets us a little bit better of a spot. And then let's actually see how that renders in the Chrome inspector. So what I'm doing is I want to actually see how that overlay is rendering. So we've got that, you can see it. So now what we can do is likely we can set the padding to 50%. And that's a little bit better. Trying to get away from hard coding the height and the width of our overlay. That's really not ideal. So that height 100% is causing some problems for us along with the padding, so we're going to eliminate that. And for this icon overlay, I think we want to try and set the padding top. Let's see if that sets us up. Still not getting the right positioning that we're looking for. Again, we'll use the Chrome inspector to see where we are. So we want to know the width of our box, which right now is bigger than 300 pixels, which is not ideal. So our icon overlay in our episode thumbnail, the width right now is exceeding the width of the image, which is not ideal. We want to see a 300 value in that particular box, in that element. So we see that 344, so actually we're in pretty good shape. Basically we want this div to reflect the width of the contained image. And here, we want this icon overlay to basically show up in the middle. So the better thing to do might be to actually place the span in the middle of the icon overlay. So let's try to do that. So we're getting a little long with our CSS selector, but again, we're trying not to repeat ourselves in the markup. FA stack. We're going to display this as a block. Let's see how this affects our rendering. So our overlay is playing quite a bit of tricks on us. So we're going to back out those changes. And we want to get this exactly centered vertically, which is actually quite a challenge in modern web development, which is kind of an annoyance in and of itself. So what we can do actually is if we set the margin that may help us. Getting a little closer. All right, getting somewhere. So pushing this down by a margin of 25% is getting us pretty close to center. We may have to make some adjustments. But let's get our font size appropriate for this spot. If you notice, it's a little bit larger. So we want to make sure we make that a little bit larger. It's a little too large. And there we go. So we're in better shape. Still looks like we're slightly off center, and that's likely a function of not considering the actual dimensions of the item itself, the overlay itself. So we should just quickly eye this and see if we're exactly in the center. And it looks like there is some additional white space that is occurring as a function of a margin. So we should see where that's getting applied. That's on the icon overlay. Let's actually eliminate that margin. See how that affects things. And we're at perfect center. Awesome. So you see how even doing the simplest thing like vertically aligning an element on top of another element can be an enormous can of worms. But here through problem solving and just trying a few different things, we finally got to the end result. So hopefully seeing me struggle a bit there actually was fruitful and helpful in sort of seeing how we approach those types of problems. I'm actually going to move this up a little bit because the vertical alignment looks a little off. There we go. Cool. All right, so let's finish up the header for today's episode. So if we can go back to the design finally now. and take a look at our H1 and start to modify that. So we're going to text align that to the left. And there's a little bit of white space underneath the video container. So the main video player itself is going to have a little bit of a margin. Is that? It's actually a little more pronounced than that. There we go. It looks like the video itself has a little bit of a border, a subtle border as well. So we're gonna give the border around the icon. You can sort of see that subtle border around the... And we should really use an eyedropper tool to actually get the actual color there. So if we really zoom in on that color using preview here, and I have this little digital color meter that I downloaded previously. So we really want to cover that gray. So we can blow this up even more to get to that color. Sometimes you have to really zoom in. All right, so the pixel, we want the hex values here, generic RGB. So that's 314040. And there we go, we achieved that border. Great. Okay. Zoom back out to sanity here. And let's style the paragraph. So the paragraph here, we want to text align left. And actually what we may want to do is actually create a section that relates all of this information. Section, and we'll call this video description. Main video description. Notice that for this masthead, I'm being pretty granting with my ID-based selectors because there's only going to be one sort of occurrence of each of these things in the masthead. So I'm being really forthcoming with my IDs. So that will allow me to set the text align to the left. So we're talking about the main video description. Which also allows us to eliminate that special treatment for the H1 that's further up here. So we can take that out because it's redundant to the container CSS that we just implemented. And there we go. Looking good there. Okay, so we want to make that text a little bit smaller. Can bump that up just a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. Awesome. Okay, so we've finished that. It looks like we've got some padding and then a border applied to this. So we're going to use that same border that we set on the image, but we'll probably make it a little bit stronger from a weight standpoint. Let's see what that looks like. We just want that border on the bottom. It's actually a little hard to see because my dock is in the way. Let's hide that. Just zooming in a little bit here. But for whatever reason, I can't scroll, so I'm going to close out this page and reopen it. And we'll switch back to that mobile view. Sometimes Chrome's inspector tool kind of freezes things up, so I have to refresh the page. And that's what I did there. So it looks like we're actually pretty on point with that border. Awesome. All right, so what remains is the mobile display of the previous and the next. And what we're actually going to do is we're not going to have a previous because this is episode number 1, but we will have a next. So, but we're going to need to mark up the previous so that the next shows up properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new section. And we'll call it the episode, main episode navigator. And we'll have the previous episode. And the next episode. And actually we can isolate these by the fact that they're sections inside here, so we're okay there. We don't need a special class that unifies them. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to mark up the previous episode so that we can make sure when there is a previous episode that things look as they should. So I'm going to say here, H3 previous, H2, and remember, I'm focused on the semantics here. I'm not yet focused on how this is going to look. I'm just trying to get the semantics right. Use some lorem ipsum here. And I'm going to leave that as is for right now and see what work we have to do. And we have a timestamp. And again, I want to use similar syntax to what I used in the previous episode where I have this p-class timestamp. So we're going to use that. And let's see what this looks like. It's probably not going to look very awesome. And as we guessed, it looks actually pretty bad. So we're going to use CSS to overwrite some of these issues that we're seeing here. So we're talking about the main episode navigator. And we know we have some work to do with the H3 and the H4. Or the H2, I'm sorry, H2. All right, so the H3 is going to be white, I believe. It's actually going to be that gray color that is consistent with the paragraph text. Just trying to get a feel for what that color is. I believe we set it on the body. Yep, the 777 text. So that's what we're going to set here. And we're going to use a new rule called text transform that's going to uppercase everything in that H3. So we should start to see some of that text change as a result of some of the work that we did, but it doesn't look like it took effect. So let's verify everything that we have in our... So we've got the main episode navigator ID and then the H3. And it doesn't look like it's showing up here in the CSS. So let's make sure we have that properly saved. Oh, I had a typo in the selector. There we go, making some headway. All right, so font size, we're gonna make that smaller. And it looks like there's a border that's being applied. So we're gonna set the border to none. And in general, we're probably going to want to make the offending selector there a little bit less bland and generic. So we may have to get more specific on our index page to eliminate some of the styles that are getting set on the navigator header. So this H3, there's a lot of opinionated settings here. So it may make sense for us to make a more specific selector for this particular element. So let's go ahead and go into our index page and see how we can make that H3 a little less opinionated. So that's in the overview. So I'm going to actually set that in an overview. So we don't inherit a lot of those rules. Great, okay. We do need to make the font weight a little higher. Let's see if font weight bold just gets the job done for us. That looks pretty close. And the main episode navigator itself needs a little bit of margin on the top. And it looks like there's equal white space, maybe a little more. So on our main video, where the margin bottom is 0.7 rem, we want margin top on the main episode navigator to be somewhat consistent. Let's see how that looks. So that's not as strong of a margin because it also has to take into consideration padding. So let's identify the padding that's at play here using the Chrome Inspector. That's actually the P tag that's offering an REM of 1. So that's a little better. Okay, so we can tighten all this up a little bit later, but I want to get to the sort of the division that we have here. So we'll tighten that up in the next episode when we expand the desktop view. We want that aqua color. And again, this is an area where we may need to get more specific in our index. So I'm going to actually disambiguate this H2 to only apply when, Nope, we're gonna actually get more specific on the main episode navigator so that we disambiguate the font size here a little bit and make that a little bit smaller. And it needs to be slightly smaller than what we set for class number 1. So we're going to look at that H1 that we set up here. So we're going to make that maybe 1.15 REMs. And we're going to make that font weight bold. And one thing that might be unintuitive is that, believe it or not, this is going to be justified all the way to the right, which we're going to have some challenges with, because if you look at the text itself, it's aligned to the left. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the text align to left for now. And we're just going to get the components looking the way that they need to look. There's actually no paragraph text, so we can get rid of that. And we want this timestamp to essentially reflect what we've reflected here, which is that sort of dark gray. So we can actually just make this a general rule as long as it's consistent in the other design. It looks like it is. Let's actually get the color using this digital color meter tool. Again, we're going to get a little crazy on the zoom. It's still too grainy. Well, let's see what happens when we get less specific here. That actually looks pretty good. Pretty consistent with what we have reflected here. Now we have to be careful when we make a modification to this selection because we could negatively impact what's happening on the index. So we want to make sure that whatever change we make for the detail screen is also applicable for the index. And this is some of the things that you have to be a little careful about when you're attempting not to repeat yourself. $58.32. I think we're okay. I think we're going to stick with that. There's probably some margin stuff that we need to tighten up. If you notice, the white space here is not looking quite in line. Again, that's something that we can tighten up a little later. Let's focus on getting this division in place. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use what's called a Pseudo Selector. And we covered this a little bit, but in most modern browsers, what you can do is select elements based on where they show up in the sequence. So here we've got a section that represents the first element contained by the main episode navigator. This is going to apply only to our previous episode section. So it's only going to apply to this. And we could select that too using the ID-based selector. That would also be more efficient. So let's go ahead and do that instead. So we're going to do the previous episode. And we're going to set the border right to 2px, and we're going to use the same as what we did for the bottom of the main video description. And we'll probably have to set some padding. You can see the border here. So now comes some of the more tricky work of getting the two elements to show up split screen. And to do so, we're going to take advantage of Foundation to help us with this responsive sort of design here. So mobile-wise, it makes sense for them to show up sort of, if we turn on our mobile display, we probably just want them to show up vertically. So in this case, we actually only want this to happen in the context of a larger display. So we're going to make a media query that mimics some of the other media queries that we've used presently, 400 pixels. And this is only going to apply for larger displays. So if we refresh the page, that border will no longer show up. And then from there, probably what we want to do, media min width or max width 400 pixels. We'll probably set a nice border on the bottom. There we go. Now this is starting to shape up. So from there, what we can do is take our markup that we did for the previous episode and essentially duplicate it for the next episode. And if we wanted to be compliant with the design, what we can do is just copy over what we have there. And this is saying foundations of programming. And we can update the timestamp to be 0104, just to show a little bit of variance. Just like that. So we likely need some margin on the next. So let's see how that is being set. We're actually going to set this main episode navigator margin on each section. Just like so. And there we go. So we've got a nice mobile display and mobile variant of this desktop display for at least the masthead. In the next episode, we'll actually finish up with the class notes on the mobile display and duplicate our catalog setting as we show here. So we probably have another 2 or 3 episodes to go before we've got our finalized 2 sections or 2 pages happening. So join us as we start to round out the mobile design for this detail page and ensure that it looks great both on a mobile experience and on a desktop experience. We're going to round out these pages, and that's going to finish us up for the HTML show. In today's episode, you saw me struggle a little bit, and that can happen quite a bit with CSS, particularly when it comes to vertical alignment. So hopefully you can relate to that experience of knowing the aesthetic that you wanted to achieve, but not yet being able to make it work in the CSS code. That's okay, you just keep experimenting, keep hacking at it, and eventually you achieve the aesthetic that you're looking for. Thanks, and I hope you'll join us in our next episode. See you then.